So I had the pleasure of meeting Randy a little more than 2 years ago at an online conference. And when I heard him speak, it was one of those things where I don't necessarily say this often, but listening to him was one of those rare experiences where I realized that everything that I'd taken as fact, I now had to question, and maybe it wasn't necessarily true. So at that moment, I knew this was someone that I definitely wanted to get to know better. And I'm happy to say that he's been a very generous and patient teacher to me over the last couple of years. I think those of you who've seen him speak elsewhere or at our online community guide conference a couple years ago definitely know what I'm talking about. And I think for those of you who are hearing and seeing him for the first time, you'll get to know what I'm talking about after you hear him today. So Randy has so many accomplishments. We were talking about that a little bit at lunch over the last 30 years that I could go on for a while, but I won't. I will, though, go through a few of Randy's highlights that he sent a little bit earlier, so he wouldn't have to put this in a slide in his prezo. So I summed it all down to this. Randy is a social pioneer who's had numerous industry firsts, which include the first virtual world, first avatars, and the first online marketplace. He's an inventor with more than a dozen granted and pending patents in social media, virtual worlds, and distributed objects and reputation systems and online identity. He's a consultant who serves on many advisory boards, including the Rochester Institute of Technology. And he spent 5 years as the director of community at Yahoo, where he worked on Yahoo 360 and many of the things that are going on at Yahoo. And he's also an author who's written numerous white papers and chaptered lots of chapters in different books. But we're fortunate to have him here today to talk about the book that he co-authored with Bryce Glass, Building Web Reputation Systems. So please join me in welcoming Randy Farmer.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. That was very humbling. Today, I am going to talk a little bit about some things that are covered in, familiar faces, that are covered in the book that Bryce and I wrote. But the reason they're in the book is really important, and we're pulling them out as the 5 things we found over and over in working with people about reputation systems are common mistakes that are made over and over and over again. I still hear them almost every week when I start bringing up these subjects. So this talk is really an advance. If it helps sell the book, fine, but it really is trying to advance the kind of state of the discussion about reputation on the web. As Katina mentioned, I co-authored this book with Bryce Glass, who was a user experience designer for Yahoo while I was there, and he did experience design specifically around reputation systems. When I left Yahoo a couple years ago and I said I wanted to start writing a book, he just jumped up and said, let's write a book for Yahoo Press / O'Reilly on reputation. And so I went, great, I don't have to write my first book all by myself. I get to work with someone else who's actually excellent at visual communication. And so the graphics, these little guys, are all by him. So that's why I want to make sure to give him a shout out in this presentation today. So as I said, we worked with dozens of product managers. I've actually been doing reputation work for almost 20 years. It didn't have that name. We were trying to figure out how people would evaluate each other's content and share it with others. People came along and worked on things like search relevance. That's a form of reputation. But we made in all these years, we've observed that reputation systems are kind of play a critical role in the operation of all web businesses. In fact, I don't have a slide on it here. And at the end of the first chapter of the book, I call out the top 25 traffic sites as of the publishing date of the book. All of them use reputation systems, at least for abuse mitigation and a bunch of other things. So these are the 5 missteps. I'm not going to read them now because you're going to hear about them all in detail. By far, these come up the most often when talking about reputation systems. Not understanding this can have significant repercussions on your product designs. So the first one, it's the people dummy. To start a discussion about reputation, you have to get to definitions right away. Because if you ask someone on the street or even a random product manager, what is reputation, they'll say, it's about who's good and who's bad? Who's the good guys and who's the bad guys? The first thing you think of is reputation for people, right? Can I trust them? Well, eBay's got a reputation, right? So whether or not I can trust them as a seller. So in order to illustrate this, I'm going to ask Katina to stand back up. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to define it by using an example. So though we often say it's only about people, this conversation, I hope, will elucidate why that's just too narrow a definition. This is a conversation between Robert and Bill. I'll be Robert. Katina will be Bill. Yeah. Your voice is deep, but not that deep. Robert has taken Bill to a business dinner at a Boston seafood restaurant, Italian restaurant, that was recommended by a coworker. And while they're talking about business, they strike up a personal conversation because they know each other and trust each other a little. So, our Wendy's going to Harvard next year.
Ah, really? I'm curious. Why Harvard?
Well, Harvard has a great reputation, especially for law.
Did she consider Yale?
Yes, she did, but Harvard's close to the house, so we'll see her more often.
Won't that be expensive?
Yes, but we'll make the trade-offs. Our baby's worth it. Thanks.
All right. Easy.
Now, that was a very short little talk, and there was a lot of reputation that went on in that story. Most importantly, no one said anything about how good or bad any other person was. There's not a person evaluation in there at all. And over the years, we've come to refine the definition of reputation to be the words on the screen here. Reputation is information used to make a value judgment about an object or a person. In fact, most of that discussion was all about objects or entity evaluations. We've been able to simplify the structure. Okay, you know, we're talking about taking, it's not just what is reputation, you want to represent it in a database somehow, you want to talk about it structurally, you want an atomic unit for interacting. So we came up with, and I was at Yahoo 5 years ago, what we call the reputation statement. It's a really simple triple. A source makes a claim about a target. It's the same thing as I said before. It's information used to make a value judgment about an object or a person. So the object or a person can either be the source or it can be a target, and the claim is the type. And we reduced that down. We made a little arrow, and we transformed it to this unit. And it is an example implied in the statement, in the conversation, that Wendy, my daughter, chose Harvard. That's a reputation statement. She did take an action, and it has a reputation effect on Harvard, at least to her parents and to their friend, Robert. I'll go even further and lay out here in this picture a small set of the reputation statements that are all part of the context and the discussion. So you can see this formulation used over and over. So Bill likes Italian food, and that's why Robert wanted to take him there, but he didn't know a good restaurant, so he had to trust the taste of a coworker. That's a reputation statement about a person. And likewise down the line, Wendy chose Harvard, Bill chose Harvard. There's a special case in the right side where you see that the source is a cluster of user icons. We call it the aggregate source. In fact, the only stuff that was explicitly discussed in the conversation was aggregate. Other than Wendy made a choice, and by implication Bill made a choice. The aggregates, people recommend Harvard. People recommend Harvard for law. People say Yale is as good as Harvard for law, right? So these are reputation statements. But there's still a discussion about reputation for people. Is there a kind of distinction? And we found over the years that yes, there's a huge distinction between reputation for objects and entities and groups than there is for people. And we call the reputation for people karma. That's how special it is. We make sure we carve off a special name. So sometimes we're talking about entity reputation, which is reputation for short, or user reputation, which we call karma for short. This is a list from a blog post that you'll find if you want to look it up, that we put together, pulling all the karma rules out of the book into one place. So if you do a search for building a reputation system on karma, you'll find this post. I'm not going to read it all here. There's a lot of qualifiers that don't necessarily apply when you're talking about rating a movie. these are so important. In fact, out of the 5 rules, the 5 misconceptions, 3 of them, and we're already done with one. 3 of them will be about karma specifically, about user reputation. Just know for now, before we move on, that adding karma to a website, meaning publicly displaying a user's reputation, is perilous and should be considered very carefully. So, reputation isn't just about people. It's any information used to make a value judgment. It's pervasive. Even when you have a small conversation like that, there's probably 20 or 30 reputations that went into setting it, and then they're folded into the conversation. We can't get through life without it. Given that it's such an important primitive, no one can evaluate all the things they have to do personally. You can't test every university by going to it. You can't test every restaurant by going to it. We know this is why we build these databases, and we build these even verbal reputation systems and written ones. It's pervasive. So it was very strange for us when we wrote the book because there was no book on the topic. There were books on PageRank, that's great. And there were books about recommender systems, which means people who like this also like that. Those are very complex systems. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about this greater fabric of I trust, who do I trust, and why do I trust them? But for all the difficulty I just talked about and how pervasive it is, karma is even harder to get right. In fact, most people are challenged to name more than one successful karma system online. There are not very many. Most of them fail for some of the reasons we'll discuss. So we'll start with the first one. There's this idea that you could have a universal karma score. So this is the classic question: should your /.karma count over on Reddit? Should your eBay score affect some other shopping site or other unrelated sites? More than a few startups have formed over the last 5 years to create the grand unified karma, which is enough to measure the man and tell you, is he a trusted person? This idea is pervasive. Yahoo, in fact, during the 5 years I worked there, and I worked on reputation from the very beginning to the very end of my time there, consistently asked me to consider building one of these, the Yahoo Karma. The idea is this would be the trusted Yahoo user, and you'd be a real person or good citizen reputation system across the entire web. You could take it everywhere. And the way they expressed it really got at the point. They said it would be like a credit score for the internet. And in fact, some of these little companies that have crashed on the rocks have used similar language. So actually the cool thing is we can actually look at credit score and talk about its global applicability and just use the model that they use, the way you tend to think about this intuitively, and reflect it back and say, test it a little bit and see if it'll survive. So we're going to talk about FICO, probably the most well-known American credit score. There are numerous ones, but I'm going to talk about this one because I have a lot of data on it. It's an 850-point score. It represents something called credit worthiness. This is the word they invented for it. It is affected and reduced by these scores, whether or not you make on-time payments, how much of your credit is used up, how long you've been a credit customer, the kinds of things you would normally fold into a reputation like this. These inputs actually predict and describe your credit use behavior. The inputs reflect the value of the output. For most of its 50 years, this credit score was used only for that purpose. Then recently, they decided that they could expand their markets, the people who provide these, in this case, Fair Isaac is the name of the company. That's what the FI stands for in FICO. They said, we could sell this data to more people. I'm going to take a little side trip here because I've discovered some more data since I first wrote this. One of the things that people use this score for is as a substitute reputation for hiring someone. So when you're going to hire someone, in the old days, like 5 years ago, you used to be able to ask for a letter of recommendation. You used to be able to call up the guy's old boss and say, is this guy a good guy? And the guy could say, maybe not. Right? We had these kinds of problems. The law has changed, and basically most companies, and I'm sure Google is like this, will no longer give recommendations positive or negative, because if you don't give negative ones, then refusing to give a positive one is a negative one. So what's happened is the reputation system, which is referrals and recommendations and calling your boss, has collapsed. And they were looking for a substitute. And they went, whoa, we've got this global score called credit score. We're going to use your credit score to determine whether or not you're a good guy. Right? Now, so you credit score to buy your house, credits maybe makes sense. Rent an apartment, oh, it's getting a little cheesy, maybe. But to find a job leaves you with this bizarre thing. This thing I said before about the inputs matching the outputs. Well, now you have this situation where if you have a low credit score, you probably need a job so that you can make money to pay off your credit and improve your credit score. If they're using your credit score to deny you a job, this is a feedback loop that because your employability is in fact not a factor, right? It's not like you instantly get a better credit score because you get a job. So why on earth should it be evaluated? In fact, since this has been written, since the book has been written, a study has come out that said there's in fact no correlation between your FICO score and your effectiveness as an employee. That in fact, this substitute global use is not only meaningless in kind of the theoretical sense, in the practical sense. So despite the intuition that a good guy is going to have a good credit score and a bad guy is going to have a bad credit score, therefore that applies to your job, it turns out to be false, straight up false. Now this leaves employers in a fix. Now we can't use the substitute score either. But I hope this makes my point that the context for this is creditworthiness. The inputs are creditworthiness and the output is creditworthiness. You shouldn't use it across contexts. All reputation is in context. And in fact, if you remember I asked earlier about these various things, these systems, all the ones I have up here, eBay, SAT, FICO, so these are all reputation scores, and they all just mean exactly what they are, right? Your eBay reputation, it's not, by the way, it's not even yours, it's this account, and this account represents a business, not you, thank goodness. It only represents transaction worthiness. You actually have to complete a transaction to evaluate the person, right? So at least they've closed the loop up and said what it's about. So people who say, I want to use your eBay feedback over on Reddit don't even know what they're talking about. These are unrelated things. You can be the chairman of Microsoft and cheat at online poker, and those are unrelated things. So there is no universal score. And in fact, there's a lot, even when you think of a score, you're probably still thinking of it too broadly. Reputation is always in a context, the narrower, the better. So the next one, all I need is 5 stars or thumbs up or dig style voting. And this kind of goes after the rating system of Vogue. Today's is like. 2 years ago it was 5 stars. Well, it was 5 stars, then it was digging, and now it's liking. And these are the rating systems of Vogue. And I want to talk a little bit about why you just don't get to pick them randomly. You actually really have to try to understand what's going on. So this is a story about a site called Chowhound. And this is an example of what we call interface-first design. And I encountered this at Yahoo. I have stories I'll tell you off the record if you're interested. But I'm sure you guys have them too, about mock-based design, where some well-meaning UI designer says, I'm going to do a design for user evaluation of some things, like restaurants. We'll just drop in stars, or we'll just drop in likes, or whatever, because they'll just pick the one that's Vogue. Well, so here's an example of how this can mess things up. So Chowhound was a community site for finding really interesting things to eat in unusual places. That's its charter, and it was initially a message board. It's message boards. So people would say, oh, I just got back from San Antonio. I found this little taco truck in the corner that goes over here. It has the most amazing X. But don't eat anything else. It'll make you sick, right? And the big discussion that unfolds about these diamonds in the rough is exactly what the culture was built on, right? Finding the best pastrami sandwich in New York means just the pastrami sandwich, nothing else, right? So twice the site got bought, and its last owner is currently CBS. CBS product designers said, hey, we can capture more value from this site because we have all these businesses mentioned. Let's put in a 5-star rating system so that people can rate the restaurants. They added stars. This is the absolute wrong thing to do. First of all, the community revolted, because now they were being asked to do something they never wanted to do in the first place. If they wanted to do that, they would be over on Yelp. That's where you do that. Here they were having these diamond and rough discussion. But you're also asking people to rate things that the ratings are going to be lower and less meaningful. Because what you're saying is this is the best place for pastrami, but otherwise it's a 2-star restaurant. It's like, why would you do that? You're trying to say something nice. This contrast doesn't produce any value. And in fact, if you go to the site, there's no uppick. No one's rating them. It's pretty much all ignored. This is the wrong context for this kind of evaluation. In fact, I suggested in a blog post the correct evaluation for this is probably free-form text for best for. And you put in text and you can do recognition. You guys are really clever. You know where to take this so that pastrami, you can say, gosh, lots of people say this is good for pastrami. So when you type in pastrami, it gives you the best pastrami place. And it doesn't have any stars whatsoever. It just says 67 Chowhounds think this is the best place for pastrami in New York. So let's look at some other ineffective data. This has been stripped of its quantitative value, but it still has this. These are the 5-star ratings distributions for 9 of Yahoo properties as of a couple of years ago. All of them except the one in the center, which you probably can't read, says Autos Custom, have the same characteristic and something we call the J-curve. The J-curve says that basically people only rate things 5-star and maybe a little bit 1-stars. If you see that curve, what you're getting is this distribution telling you there's something about your design that isn't really reflecting what people intuitively think is a star distribution. The one in the Auto Custom, in fact, does have a good distribution. So when we talk about J-curves, it turns out most of the internet has J-curves. Most of the review sites have this problem. I think it's because when you do design like Yahoo Local or Yahoo Shop, well, let's do Yahoo Local, it's easiest. You say, I want to go someplace for good pizza. So you type in pizza in Palo Alto, and it gives you the list of the best places in Palo Alto. Which are the ones you're going to rate? You're going to rate the ones that are displayed. So there's a bias in the presentation that says only rate high. Wall Street Journal reported that they've done a comprehensive review, and the average 5-star rating value is 4.3 stars. That's way high, given what, and there's a bunch of things packed in there, and a book talks about things like acquiescence bias and a bunch of other things. But what I wanted to point out is sometimes the scale should be reviewed. The one about Autos Custom was special because it was users evaluating user content, and it was never highlighted as the best content is at the top of some search. You would type in Ford. Basically, cars had their own little profile pages called garage pages. And you could do searches across your favorite kind of car, and you would find everybody's stuff. And they would evaluate it. And this is the only time I've ever seen 1 stars almost as high as 5 with a distribution in between. The 1 stars, if you observe them, what they were is you didn't upload a picture of your modified car, or worse, you uploaded a stock picture of your car. This is a mod site, and you'll get a 1-star rating for that. Let's dig into an example close to home. YouTube recently changed its interface for evaluating reviews, or evaluating videos. This is a video as of several months ago. It used 5 stars. I'm sure you all know this if you're paying attention, but if you haven't been paying attention, I'll share it. People only ever rated the thing 5 stars. In fact, this is the distribution for YouTube. It's a J-curve with no J. So basically, every video on YouTube was a 5-star video. Every single one, or it had no stars at all. It was either unrated or it was 5 stars. The average here is 4.8. Okay? This is an insane number. Good news is, the product manager here figured it out. They figured out that users are just liking the video. So you need likes. Great. Good news. They implemented likes. Down in the corner here on the left, it says like. There's a thumb with a like next to it. That's correct. That's matching the user behavior. But what kind of surprised us a little is there's a little thumb down next to it with no text. And I encountered this at Yahoo, on Yahoo TV, when they put in, I convinced them not to rate TV episodes because only fans rate episodes, so you're wasting your time. It'll be just like this. I pointed at YouTube and said it's going to be just like YouTube. Don't do that. They said, OK, let's put in thumbs up. I said, well, I want you to do favorites, but thumbs up will work. And then they couldn't resist putting in thumbs down. Because let's look at the distribution of thumbs up for thumbs down. Guess what? It's exactly the same as it was with the ratings they've had. So YouTube, they know if you don't like it. You know how they know you don't like it? Not because you put a thumbs down on it. It's because you didn't watch it all the way through, right? So do you need downvote? So whenever you're thinking about an upvote, this is another one of those intuitions. I'm cracking at intuitions that people have. If I have a thumb up, I must have a thumb down. Well, part of that is maybe you shouldn't be using a thumb up. You should use a star like Facebook and favoriting. Because once you get that icon, everyone goes, I gotta have that. This is a result of what my co-author calls, symmetrical thinking versus balanced thinking. So symmetrical says, if I have an up, I must have a down. Well, in fact, you only need a down in a situation where you're making a decision between things. Like if you're going to vote for A or B, then you have a reason to choose between them. Or if you're trying to pass a piece of legislation and you want your vote to be counted, and it either, it's going to actually make something happen. Evaluating a thing, saying I like it, is not symmetrical in that sense. There's no need to say dislike because no one knows what they mean. And in fact, as I was saying at lunch, we've seen what happens when you create those systems. If you look at, I like to point at movie sites like Yahoo Movies or your favorite one that allows user reviews. If you look at the helpful votes, if you look at the movie reviews that have the most helpful votes in total, helpful plus unhelpful, you'll find an interesting pattern. Whether or not the majority of people say it's helpful or unhelpful, they are best written reviews. What happens is at scale, people start using these things to say agree or disagree. They get repurposed. And when you put in a thumbs down, that's one of the things that happens. They're saying something else, and now it's all confusing your signal. If you have a better way to get at negative feedback, get it that way. If you want negative feedback, like this person is breaking the rules, have a different interface, which is usually what people call flagging interface for terms of service. When talking about, Bryce talks about balance versus symmetry, what he's saying is when people first set things up, like he talks about a train set, people will put 3 soldiers on one side and 3 soldiers on the other side to make it the same because they can't figure out that sometimes you want a tank and a soldier against 3 soldiers. It'll give you that same aesthetic feedback, but it looks less awkward. So when you're thinking about designing for what reputation scores you pick, try to pick the ones that fit the pattern you're trying to accomplish, not meet some innate measurement. If no one's saying no, don't ask them to say no. Don't ask for information you don't need and you don't want. So obviously, whatever the hot thing is, what you need to do instead is figure out from your context what's the right thing. And be sparing. There was an example at Yahoo where they had a rating for the show and they had thumbs up and thumbs down for each episode I was telling you about. It turned out people missed the rating because they were just clicking on the thumbs up. They were rating the episodes, but they thought they were rating the show because no one rates episodes. And so they were gathering the same I like this show data on every episode and completely missing that there were stars as a way to rate the show. And so they were going, don't ask for 2 ratings that are the same thing. And downplay the downvote. Next, competition is always good. These days, game mechanics for software, for web software, are all the rage. You only need to add points. Or you need a leaderboard so that people can compete with each other because it produces a lot of incentive. So I'm going to tell you another story about another site called Consummating. You may not have heard of it because it's not around anymore. It was a dating site, as you might guess from the name. And its point, it was, the designers thought, well, we'll add some game mechanics to kind of spice this up a little bit, get it going. We want people to be nice to each other. They're being a little snipey. So we're going to give them points to give to each other for being nice. And of course, guess what? They went with symmetry instead of balance, and they said, well, we also allow you to give negative points. So when you go on a date with someone, you can either say, oh, it was a great date, or that date sucked. And in order to get the ability to evaluate, people had to evaluate you. So they created this chain where it was supposed to build up. It completely and utterly destroyed the business. As people started playing that game instead of the dating game of actually meeting people, and right, they were trying to get other people. This is one of the places you first hear the term point whoring, which is the process of doing whatever it takes to get people to give you points so then you can evaluate other people. Ben Brown, I highly recommend you read his blog post about this. It's called "I Love My Chicken Wire Mommy," and this is excerpted from it. But the way I like to put it is, when you're creating a reputation system for incentives, when you're using it in a gaming mechanic, if the only thing if that's the only reason people are participating in the action, you have a real problem with your site. People should be motivated to do the things that provide the most value for you and them in a mutual way, and these are supposed to help you. What happens is these sites, these mechanisms, often decay to be the only reason to participate. And when you do that, you lose all the value, because now you have people playing point games with each other who are providing no value to the service, and your company tanks. In our book, actually, we talk a lot about different incentive systems. I talk about altruistic incentives, where people are cooperating with each other or providing information at large just because they think it's important. And I have some subcategories of that. I talk about egocentric, which is, things for personal use. Probably the most important. Google search is the ultimate example of egocentric incentives. I type something in, I'm trying to get an answer to something, and I click through and I got it. That was successfully playing on the egocentric incentive model. But sometimes egocentric means I want to show people that I'm better than other. I want to be a master at something, and I want to demonstrate it. So leaderboards and stuff tend to live in the egocentric space. And then something I call commercial, where people are interacting with each other with a clear output in mind. So a lot of bloggers, I'm a commercial blogger. I'm building my brand and I'm doing commercial activity now by talking about stuff I've learned. So there's if you think of these across this spectrum, which Bryce Glass developed while he was at Yahoo, on the left is caring and collaborative. That's where altruistic incentives tend to live. Cordial through collaborative is where commercial tends to live, and combative are where a lot of the egocentric incentives live. And hopefully from the story I already told you, you can see that you really don't want to mix these. You got people over in collaborative for a dating site. Last thing you want is leaderboards and competition between them. It's certainly surfaced on the site. What goes underneath is what goes on. So it doesn't matter. None of these are good or bad. You just want to line up the things you're designing with the right kinds of things. So competition is fine if the context calls for it. If you are a World of Warcraft player, your reputation, what level you are, and how quickly you beat this monster and everything, excellent. Leaderboards, local leaderboards with your friends, all kinds of patterns. It's a game. Game mechanics are perfect. And even some things that aren't already games, adding game mechanics is great. Zynga and places like that are making a fortune out of that. But don't assume there's cooperation where there's none. If you have an altruistic community and you start, you have a message board for cancer survivors, and you turn on points, they're leaving. They hate you now because you've turned their altruistic community into a competitive community without even asking. And when karma is involved, user reputation, it escalates the fastest. So, if you get incentives for writing reviews and you get a piece of a camera but no one else knows, maybe that makes sense for some things. But as soon as you create a leaderboard, one of the things to learn about leaderboards is they only incentivize n+1 users. And those n are the size of your leaderboard. Right? Everyone who's on the leaderboard is incentivized to stay, and the one person who's just below it is incentivized to try to get up. Everyone else is basically disincentivized. If you start late, we have a post on this called Leaderboards Considered Harmful. You can read all about it. And the last one today is negative karma will out the bad guys. This is another idea that is very pervasive, is that you could assign a public score to a user that says how good they are in some context. Let's keep it in context. I'm not saying it's global. It's a context. In this place, consummating, or this service or that service. And in fact, eBay does this. They have a reputation score. They have green stars and red stars, right? So even in context, this provides some real challenges. So this is an example, simple model, where the users are getting positive reputation for doing good things and negative reputations for doing bad things in context, whatever those are. So we have this guy as an angel, he's got 60 points, and a devil who's minus 30 points. So just hold that simplified model in mind as we go forward. So I'm going to tell my favorite cautionary tale about negative public reputation. It's called the Virtual Mafia Shakedown. And this occurred while I was running the Sims Online. For about 3 months, I ran the Sims Online right after it came out. And that was an online virtual world based on The Sims. And you can control a little avatar running around, playing with other people, and you could chat. You could run little businesses and classic virtual world stuff, but done by Electronic Arts / Maxis. It had in-game currency called the simoleon. And you earn some of those by doing tasks in the game, and you could pay some of them to other people to rent houses and things like that. So I don't have good graphics for it, so I'm using these Bryce Glass produced abstractions, but it still works. One of the important mechanics that were in it was created by Will Wright, and it was his first multi-user online game. Involved a graphic display of your friends. So it's actually ahead of your time. You have to use a special Facebook plugin to get this, which would show all the people who said that they were your friend, rendered as arrows pointing into you with circles. So there was you press F11 and up would come your face in the middle and little green circles all around you from all the people who said you were friends. And you could leave a little note and they could say why they liked you. And if you liked them back, the arrow would be bidirectional. So this is a really cool early friends graphing technology. And it was fine as far as it went. But unlike other social networks, Will really liked playing with social mechanics at first. And he allowed users to declare that you were untrustworthy. So it would say, no, you suck. And I would attach a red arrow to you, and I could leave a message on why you suck. It didn't take long before a group came along, self-named the Sims Mafia. And if you look them up, you can read about them. And they figured out how to use this to shake down customers. And it would work like this. A new customer would come in. Oh, this is kind of fun. The guy would come up and say, hi, I can see you're new to The Sims. And he'd say, yeah, if you could figure out how to type. Yeah. So he would help them figure out how to use the interface. Yeah. Then he'd say, give us all your money. It's like, what? Yeah, give me all your simoleons, or I'll make it so you cannot rent a house. I will block that function for you. And the person would say, why? And he said, well, here, bring up your friends graph. And that's usually when someone would say, what's that? And they'd say, press F11. And when you press F11, this is what you would see. All of the guys on the Sims Mafia had all posted, I hate this person messages saying, don't trust them, whatever you do, they cheat, don't rent to them, they'll steal your stuff out of your house. Because renting gave you access to the house contents. So trust was critically important. So they could literally sabotage your trust level with the entire service, with all the other users, would all go, crap, I don't trust this person. So think of this, it sounds weird, and then you go, wait, oh, that's how eBay works. Have you ever bought anything from an eBay vendor with more than 3 stars? I think not. Three red stars, I mean. 3 red stars, these are exactly the same as that. In this game, it was completely broken because this person who was paying $10 a month quit. That's how I know this story so well, because a few people who were paying $10 a month were churning through my customers by shaking them down. So, with that lesson in mind, let's look at our original simplified model again. Here's the same guys, but you'll notice the devil guy somehow now has a 0 above him. He's declared reputation bankruptcy. He abandoned his avatar and created a new one, and his score went up to 0. Isn't that awesome? So you can't actually have a negative score. Anything below start equals restart. Right? So the first premise is that greater and lesser is, positive and negative are possible to measure. In fact, again, using eBay, how many green stars are equal to 1 red star? Before you understand it, you think, well, 1 in green equals 1 red. No, 3 reds cancel an infinite number of green stars. because that account gets abandoned. 3 stars is exactly equal to -30 in this example. It's unrepairable, and you get rid of it. Likewise, think about it a little more subtly. Mr. 60 there, what if I told you yesterday his score was 360? Does he look so angelic today? You can't tell. This is a failure of the scalar model, where you just have a vector where you're adding positive and negative, and you don't show any of the history, you just show the result. You're in trouble. So the general lesson here is avoid public karma, period. If you don't need it, don't show it. You really want to know who your bad guys are? Keep those scores private. And I'm going to share a detailed, the summary of the detailed that's in the book. Chapter 10 is all about this one reputation model, the case study we did for Yahoo Answers. So I was in charge of the reputation portion of Yahoo Answers user content moderation model. And we made a model, it was in this little box. People would report a content item, there'd be a reputation model run, and we would actually hide the content, in effect removing it from experience if enough users said it's bad. Simplest version of the model is 3 strikes and you're out. It became much more complex than that, but the easiest way to describe it is when enough good reputation people say this is bad content, we'd hide it. And there's a procedure to the right for dealing with the exceptions when, if someone ganged up on someone who didn't have bad content. And so there's an abuse mitigation mechanism. So here are our goals. At the time we started, the reason we started this project is if a user flagged an item as bad on Yahoo Answers, it would take 18 hours before it was reviewed and taken down, because it went through a customer care queue. Customer care queue was costing about $1 million a year to handle that with an 18-hour lag. Our goal with this model was to reduce that to 1 hour so that the content would go away faster, bad content. We found out not only that our customer care agents were having a 10% accuracy, or 90%, only 90% accuracy. That meant 1 in 10 items that should have been hidden wasn't getting taken down, and 1 in 10 items that should have been taken down wasn't. We didn't expect to have any influence on that. We assumed users were going to be just as bad at identifying bad content as our customer support people. And like I said, we originally were running at $1 million per year. We were hoping to cut it by 90% if we were successful. So we ran the model, and we saw the following results. The amount of time it took for us to remove a bad item dropped to 30 seconds. Literally, a bad person would post some, a troll would post something, or a spammer would post something, and by the time they could go back and look to see if it was still there, it would already be gone. That users were sniping that stuff as fast as it was being produced. That's because there were a lot more good users than there were bad users. It didn't take long. The interesting thing was the evaluation error rate dropped to less than 1%, less than 0.1%. That in fact, they were actually really good at determining what was the worst stuff on the site. They were better at it than our staff. Now, admittedly, that happened because they weren't reviewing any, they weren't trying to hide any content that was questionable. But by definition, if it's not reported, it doesn't matter. So this is the actual rate. And this meant we were able to reduce the overhead to a fraction of a person, less than $10,000 to moderate that a year. So we saved the better part of $1 million a year. We found out something very exciting when we ran it. We originally saw that exception on the right, which was we called the appeal process. If you would get an email saying your stuff had been taken down, you could appeal, and then it would finally go to customer care. And so this last fraction of a person was handling these appeals. They only had to handle appeals. The appeal rate after 2 weeks precipitously dropped, and it was freaking us out. It was a few a day, up to 10 a day, and then it dropped below 1 a day, rapidly. And we couldn't figure out what happened at first. We thought maybe the users had given up or something, but no, reporters were continuing to increase their reliability. A test of the data suggested that the quality had continued to increase overall. And what we found out happened is a second order effect from a feedback system. This is a feedback system. When you start hiding bad guys' content in 30 seconds, guess what the bad guys do? They leave. They find greener pastures for trolling because they eventually just give up. We literally drove spammers and trollers off with this particular mechanism. the benefit they were getting, they were never seeing. They were only getting their jollies if someone commented and say, ew, to whatever it is they posted. Now no one was saying that, and the content was disappearing. So, as addressing the complaints before, or the all you need is negative karma. Karma is complex. I didn't talk about that too much. It's made of indirect inputs. The story about the mafia is why you shouldn't allow users to directly evaluate each other. You want them to evaluate content. The Yahoo model works because they're not evaluating users, they're evaluating content. And that content reputation then rolls up to the users. The ones who are accurately hiding get an increased score. Those who have had their stuff hidden have a decreased score. They keep it, but it's secret score, it's not public. So public karma is positive karma. And although I cross out karma will out the bad guys, I'm going to modify that to say secret, or what we call corporate karma, is in fact good. In fact, at Yahoo, head of Yahoo Security says this is their favorite and most important use of reputation for them, is tracking various attributes. I'm sure Google does the same, and then taking action about those interactions. So they'll track IP addresses, and if they think it's a spammer, they won't take active action against the spammer necessarily, but they'll do weird things like slow down their inactive rate of SMTP calls and things like that. I'm sure you guys do the same kinds of things without having to confirm it. I know what the general practices are. Once you know you've got a bad guy, you don't have to lock him out, you just have to slow him down until he doesn't cost you anything. So this is the summary list. I call the missteps corrected. I'm not going to read it again, but it's time for questions. Yes?
Yeah, I was wondering, in the beginning you talked about that study that correlated credit score with employee performance.
That's correct. What's the question?
What was that study, and then how did they come to that result?
All right, so I don't have a copy of the study yet. I only saw 2 reports of it, but it was a government study. So if you just do a search for, actually, no, I have it bookmarked. If you go to the reputation site, buildingreputation.com, which I mentioned at the beginning, there's a page which has reputation links. One of the most recent links will link to that specific article and link back to the study. Yeah, that was a big win. I've been giving this talk previously, and I had said, there's no evidence that there is a correlation. Now there's evidence there is no correlation. Yeah.
Is there practice of using credit scores for hiring been made legal by any states yet?
No, as far as I know, using credit score is still, it's never been legislated for or against. I have links to that also. There's a pointer in the book to the place. If that has changed, there's a thing called the fairemployment.org or something like that. I don't remember the exact URL, I'm sorry, but that would have everything about that because they're particularly miffed about this practice.
Does anyone in VC may have a question?
Yeah, does anyone out there in the VC have a question? Yeah, we can't see you. All right, one in the back first before.
So you argued very convincingly against using 5-star ratings when there's actually no need for 5 stars. But what about the users? Users, they've been using reputation system on Amazon, Netflix, and so on. All of those use 5 stars. So users may have come to expect 5 stars.
So I think I know what the question is, because the way you asked it, you said those who are already using 5 stars should continue using them, and I'm going to say, well, maybe. But YouTube was a perfect example of it being wrong. So my answer about whether or not to use 5 stars, based just on user experience, I think data is saying otherwise in some cases. Some cases it's the correct thing to do. That's all I'm asking you to consider. But just because other people have, doesn't mean it's the correct choice. If you're seeing, just like it wasn't for YouTube, it was the wrong choice for YouTube, absolutely. Once the data, once you look at the data, you go, oh, this is obviously the wrong choice, and change it. So you can certainly experiment with anything, because if you don't know what your community is going to do. Keep in mind, Amazon actually was suffering from the J-curve. About 4 years ago, I went to a talk where I learned the phrase J-curve and U-curve, and we did a bunch of discussion about this. And they were so frustrated by those results, that they released this thing that when you mouse over those scores now, it gives you a distribution curve. Because here's the problem. If you all assume they're J-curves, then you can interpret 4.3 as a median score, right? If you don't know that the distribution is like that, and they suffer from U-curve distributions, here's a distribution that will really freak you out. A top 10, or no, the top #1 selling book 4 weeks ago, New York Times top selling book on Amazon, which is a 4.3 average rating service, had a 3-star rating, right? Why? Well, if you look at the curve, it was a U distribution. Why was it a U distribution? You look at the ones, the answer is because Amazon's pricing policy for the Kindle edition of the book the publisher decided that this $54 book, they would not sell it on the Kindle for $20. Amazon had to change their policy if they were going to sell their book on a Kindle edition. Or they were going to wait until the value of the book dropped such that they could sell a Kindle for $20. So these were users who owned Kindles, who were pissed off that they couldn't read the book, right? So if you look at the average score, there's an indication there. All the average score is telling you is something's horribly wrong. I have to dig in deeper. So they put these mouse over so you could see the distributions. Because a U-shaped distribution average of 4.3 is a completely different meaning than a J-curve distribution of 4.3. So you are really stuck. As long as you have only one number, you need to, most times, provide more data or be absolutely sure, like the example I gave you, that you're getting this really nice distribution and it doesn't matter. And what you don't want to do is just because users say they are familiar with it, they're probably, if you ask them what the interpretation means, they probably don't know. If 5-star on YouTube means a lot of people like it, and a 3-star on certain things on Amazon means some people are pissed off at Amazon, I mean, how do you interpret? So. All right, yeah, Dirk?
This might be a long answer, so I don't know if there's time for it, but since you said that reputation is always determined in context,
yes.
There's a lot of conversations going on across the web now about federated identity and global identities, and I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Yes, the question was about global. I have a lot of thoughts about identity. In fact, I'm thinking about my next book being on identity. But the question was about reputation and federated identity.
Yeah.
I'm going to defer that to another discussion. I don't know a way to say something concise. No, I can't think of it. I keep trying to pack it down and it won't pack well. Sorry, I'll have to answer it separately. Yeah?
If I understood you correctly, you're saying that if you have a collaborative community outline, you don't want to impose a competitive reputation system.
Generally. Yeah, some people have been trying to make some counter arguments, but I haven't seen any good
ones.
ones.
If that's the case, then what kind of reputation system do you want to put on a collaborative, helpful, altruistic?
All right, so what kind of reputation systems are good for altruistic communities is kind of the question. If you don't want to have a leaderboard. So in the book, I describe 3 kinds of reputation displays. The public one, which is kind of the one where the competition comes into play. And I talked a little bit about the corporate or secret one, which is some data your company has for making decisions about people. There's one in between called private, which is between you and the service, and it gets reflected back to you. And so, for example, Google Analytics provides private reputation to lots of people who are tracking their blogs that way so that they know what people think about their visitor traffic and where they're coming from, right? So altruistic communities often look for peer feedback. So oddly, if I can give you a gift point and it just right, and is not being reflected to everyone else, that can be a very powerful motivator. So basically, look at private reputation systems and private incentive systems. So I know I'm improving. So I can still, it's interesting, you can be altruistic. When I break these incentives out, sometimes you have a combination. Sometimes it's like, well, the community is altruistic, but there's a sense of mastery, which is an egocentric thing driving some of the behavior. But it's private. So a lot of sites that are into altruistic behavior give lots of feedback individually to people. Telling them how many people read your post, right, is a really good example of me getting feedback from altruistic behavior without being compared to other people. So that the competition part is kind of manifested most of the time as public comparison, which is different from acknowledgement of contribution. So some communities do that. Some sites actually give awards to people. So they literally give physical awards and have dinners saying these people had the biggest effect on our altruistic community. Those are a form of recognition that are fairly common. They can become dangerous if they become competitive. Right? If you ever start exposing the metrics for how those are generated, next thing you know, you get you're creating people trying to do those behaviors instead of actually, doing the good work. Last one, way in the back.
So this seems, I guess, U.S. focused.
Yes, U.S. focused.
Are there other in context is really important? Cultural could be another.
Yes, good question.
Do you have any insights or any examples of where reputation means something completely
Yeah, so
different?
besides the obvious, so the question is how does this change internationally? The answer is a lot. I am not an expert in international. I'm familiar with many of the issues from the 5 years I was at Yahoo. I'm just going to tick some off. They're kind of a random hodgepodge. I don't have a concise answer for this. One is cultural indicators of things like thumb up. Watch out. Thumbs up doesn't mean the same thing here as it does elsewhere. I won't show you the same symbol here on my hand, but so there's kind of basic cultural stuff. There's a sense of sharing, like the difference between what I call the favoriting pattern, which says I like this thing and I want to surface it on my profile. How people feel about privacy. So there's a whole bunch of things associated with privacy. Also where things live on the competitive spectrum. Some cultures are way less competitive. They basically, you never create a leaderboard in certain cultures. That's just a bad idea. So the other one I wanted to point out is tied into what Dirk asked about, which has to do with identity. We have a whole section in our book on reputation is identity. And identity in other countries is fundamentally different. In Korea, for example, every transaction you chase on the internet is traced back to the equivalent of your social security number. Your citizen identity is tied to your connection. And so everything about your behavior is more tightly constrained with the sense of an internet anonymity doesn't exist there in any way like we think about it here. And so I'm just accentuating the question without answering it, saying there are fundamental cultural root cultural differences that would affect these choices. And so I'm not making, you notice I didn't make any recommendations about choices. Those would fold into the context. So I have a different talk I give called Context is Kings, where I break out various contexts, and international is this one really important context. So yeah, it's not just whether or not you're doing ratings and reviews for movies, it's ratings and reviews in Korea means something different than ratings and review in the United States.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.